Imagine yourself trying to carry on a conversation. You're speaking. I mean, here you are on your podium. Supposedly you have something to say, and you're looking out frequently at pandemonium. It becomes absurd, you know.
Joni Mitchell never held back, and when it came to certain bands, she downright despised them. Known for her razor-sharp tongue and fearless opinions, the folk legend often criticized some of the biggest names in rock history. While fans adored their music, Mitchell dismissed them with brutal honesty. Here are the top 6 bands Joni Mitchell hated the most. Carole King. Both Mitchell and King were fighting uphill battles in the 1970s, carving out space in a world where singer-songwriters were overwhelmingly male. Yet while Mitchell was pushing boundaries and challenging every rule of songwriting, King achieved massive acclaim by writing songs that Mitchell reportedly saw as safe, conventional, and comfortable. Mitchell's disdain centered around King's landmark 1971 album Tapestry, which became one of the best-selling records of all time and a cultural touchstone. Critics hailed it as groundbreaking, praising its intimacy and emotional honesty. To Mitchell, however, the praise rang hollow. She allegedly dismissed Tapestry as little more than professional songwriting with a personal veneer, claiming it was polished and pleasant but nowhere near the level of true artistic innovation. Where others saw raw emotional truth, Mitchell reportedly saw therapy session pop, music designed for people who wanted to feel deep without actually being challenged. The technical differences between the two women only sharpened the divide. Mitchell was busy reinventing the very language of music, experimenting with alternate tunings, unusual chord voicings, shifting time signatures, and jazz-influenced harmonies. In her own words, she once explained that relearning an instrument through new tunings was like going back to infancy. You have to relearn everything. She embraced that difficulty, chasing new sonic landscapes at the cost of commercial accessibility. King, meanwhile, stayed within the familiar framework of classic pop songwriting, using traditional progressions and straightforward structures. To Mitchell, this wasn't artistry. It was limitation. The personal sting came from how often the two were compared. Critics and fans loved to pit them against each other as the two great female singer-songwriters of the era. But the comparisons infuriated Mitchell. While King was celebrated as relatable, warm, and approachable, Mitchell was painted as the difficult, cerebral counterpart. She reportedly felt this dichotomy was unfair and reductive, making her own work seem pretentious simply because it demanded more from the listener. Recognition only deepened the wound. As Tapestry collected Grammys and accolades, Mitchell reportedly seethed that the industry was rewarding the path of least resistance. To her, King's success sent a damaging message that women could succeed if they played it safe, stuck to conventional formulas, and made themselves palatable. She allegedly believed this discouraged other female musicians from taking risks, reinforcing the idea that innovation was less important than accessibility. Industry insiders claimed that Mitchell would grow visibly frustrated when King's name came up at award shows or in critical discussions. It wasn't jealousy in the simple sense. It was a deeper resentment that King's triumphs seemed to come at the expense of more adventurous female voices. Mitchell reportedly felt that she and others like her were being overshadowed by what she saw as pleasant but uninspired music, and that King's dominance of the charts and critics' lists was narrowing the possibilities for women in music rather than expanding them. Elton John. If Joni Mitchell represented stripped-down truth and fearless introspection, Elton embodied spectacle, glitter, and the dazzling embrace of mass entertainment. For Mitchell, who had built her career on the radical idea that folk and popular music could be a vehicle for poetry and self-exposure, Elton John was everything she believed music should not become. Mitchell reportedly saw Elton as the epitome of 70s excess, the flamboyant ringmaster of a circus that confused costume changes with creativity. While Elton was thrilling stadiums in sequined jumpsuits, platform boots, and oversized rhinestone glasses, Mitchell looked on with open disdain. She allegedly confessed she couldn't comprehend how an artist could be taken seriously while hiding behind what she considered little more than vaudeville theatrics. To her, his elaborately staged persona wasn't an extension of artistry. It was a distraction from a lack of depth. Her contempt came through in a reported comment. "You know, and I thought, oh God, do we got to do this? So I just decided to just be naked on my record." The nakedness she spoke of was her radical honesty, the vulnerability of albums like Blue and Hejira, where she stripped away layers of pretense. In contrast, she saw Elton's outrageous stage presence as armor, a way of hiding mediocre songwriting behind circus tricks. This tension cut even deeper because both artists were pianists and composers, yet they couldn't have approached music more differently. Mitchell used her piano as a painter's canvas, layering unconventional chords, jazz structures, and shifting time signatures to create songs that demanded active listening. Elton, on the other hand, was crafting soaring pop anthems designed to ignite arenas, songs like Benny and the Jets or Crocodile Rock, built on instantly recognizable hooks and larger-than-life choruses. To his fans, Elton was a genius showman. To Mitchell, he was a salesman in glitter. Mitchell allegedly dismissed Elton's output as little more than jingle writing, catchy but hollow, songs engineered to stick in your head without leaving any real imprint on the soul. In her view, his success wasn't just a personal irritation, it was dangerous. She reportedly feared that a whole generation of young musicians would see Elton's rise and conclude that the path to stardom was paved with gimmicks and costumes rather than authentic songwriting or having something meaningful to say. The rivalry wasn't merely artistic, it was philosophical. Mitchell was adamant that music should challenge, provoke, and reveal truth. Elton, meanwhile, embraced music as pure entertainment, unapologetically fusing pop accessibility with theatrical grandeur. To Mitchell, this wasn't just a different lane of artistry. It was the commercialization of music in its purest form, the death knell of music as a serious art form. Industry gossip from the era suggested Mitchell would go out of her way to avoid events where Elton was scheduled to perform. The sight of him pounding the piano in a feathered cape and bedazzled glasses reportedly made her cringe. For her, those performances weren't harmless fun. They were a cultural warning sign, proof that audiences were being trained to equate spectacle with substance. What likely cut Mitchell most deeply was the sheer magnitude of Elton's success. While she fought for artistic respect, layering personal confession with complex musicality, Elton became one of the most commercially dominant acts in the world, selling millions of records and packing stadiums across continents. In her eyes, this imbalance revealed a devastating truth about the music industry. Depth and artistry were being shoved aside in favor of whatever glittered brightest. Bob Dylan. To the outside world, Dylan was a near-mythic figure, a poet, a revolutionary voice, a Nobel Prize winner in the making. But to Joni Mitchell, who knew both the man and the myth, he was something else entirely. Her reported disdain for Dylan wasn't just about musical taste. It was about what she saw as ego, fraudulence, and gender politics buried beneath the legend. Mitchell allegedly acknowledged Dylan's early work in the Woody Guthrie tradition as powerful, but she grew dismissive of what followed. She was quoted as saying, "I think it was Bob Dylan, really, who, not during the Woody Guthrie period of his work, but, suggesting that she felt his creative peak ended decades earlier, and that much of his subsequent acclaim was built on reputation rather than substance. Her harshest criticisms targeted Dylan's persona. She allegedly described him as a selfish egomaniac who used people and then discarded them once they no longer served his purposes. She considered his reputation as a folk prophet vastly overstated, claiming his lyrics were often pretentious nonsense dressed up as profundity. To Mitchell, Dylan wasn't a prophet. He was a performer who understood how to play the part of one. What infuriated her most was how critics and audiences seemed unwilling to challenge him. She reportedly argued that Dylan got away with mediocrity because journalists were too intimidated by his aura to call him out on his weaker material. For Mitchell, who had spent her career painstakingly crafting intricate compositions, watching Dylan receive universal praise for what she considered sloppy work was maddening. The feud was sharpened by gender politics. Mitchell reportedly resented how Dylan was automatically granted more respect and credibility despite her arguably superior musical sophistication. She had pioneered open tunings, unconventional song structures, and deeply personal storytelling that pushed the boundaries of popular music. Yet Dylan, simply by virtue of being male, was hailed as a genius while she often had to fight for recognition. She allegedly said that Dylan benefited from a cultural double standard. Male critics wanted a folk hero, and Dylan fit the bill perfectly. Mitchell also bristled at Dylan's constant reinvention of his image. While she herself evolved musically, from folk to pop to jazz and beyond, she saw those changes as organic expressions of growth. Dylan's transformations, on the other hand, struck her as calculated maneuvers designed to stay relevant. From folk prophet to electric rebel, from country crooner to born-again Christian, Mitchell reportedly believed Dylan's shifts weren't about art, they were about maintaining his legend. She allegedly said that Dylan cared more about his myth than the actual quality of his music. Perhaps her most devastating criticism was philosophical. Mitchell reportedly said Dylan had turned folk music into an ego trip, bending a genre rooted in community and protest into a vehicle for self-mythologizing. She accused him of teaching an entire generation of male songwriters that what mattered wasn't truth or emotional honesty, but sounding mysterious and important. In her view, Dylan's legacy encouraged artists to chase shadows of profundity instead of confronting reality. James Taylor. We have James Taylor, a feud that was particularly painful because it wasn't just about music, it was about betrayal of shared roots. Both Taylor and Joni Mitchell came from the same late 1960s folk scene, a world of coffee houses, protest songs, and raw storytelling. They were young songwriters who had once seemed destined to travel parallel roads, using music as a weapon of truth. But instead, those roads split. And to Mitchell, Taylor veered so sharply toward commercial safety that she could never forgive him. Mitchell, famous for her piercing honesty and innovative songwriting, once said of Taylor, "I've seen sunny days that I thought would never end." But that lyric, borrowed from Taylor's Fire and Rain, carried a sting in her retelling. For her, it symbolized the beginning of what she saw as his descent into blandness. Mitchell reportedly despised how Taylor transformed from a promising songwriter into what she scornfully called corporate folk music for suburban housewives. What fueled her bitterness was the way Taylor's rise contrasted with her own trajectory. While he was polishing his sound for radio play, Mitchell was diving headfirst into experimentation, weaving jazz phrasings into folk, writing dense, unconventional chord progressions, and tackling subjects far riskier than heartbreak and nostalgia. By the early 1970s, Taylor was cementing himself as the soft-spoken troubadour of mainstream America, whereas Mitchell was releasing daring works like Blue and the Hissing of Summer Lawns. To her, Taylor's success confirmed an ugly truth. The music industry didn't want boundary pushers. It wanted comfort food. Mitchell allegedly couldn't stand Taylor's smooth, carefully polished approach to folk, which she believed stripped away the raw nerve, the political fire, and the personal vulnerability that had given the genre its power. Taylor was writing hits like Fire and Rain and You've Got a Friend, while she was constructing sprawling, layered explorations of identity and culture. In Mitchell's eyes, he wasn't just succeeding, he was showing younger musicians that the safe route, the paint-by-numbers approach, as she allegedly called it, was the road to reward. The personal dimension only made this rivalry sting more. Both were fixtures of the same California music scene in Laurel Canyon, a close-knit circle that included Carole King, Jackson Browne, and Crosby, Stills and Nash. They had mutual friends, crossed paths at the same parties, and even collaborated within overlapping circles. Yet Mitchell reportedly found Taylor's personality as dull as his music, too safe, too careful, unwilling to take risks either artistically or politically. While she was speaking out, aligning herself with radical ideas and pouring her demons into her lyrics, Taylor seemed content to float above the turbulence, serenading audiences without shaking any foundations. Industry insiders whispered that Mitchell's disdain was no secret. She would allegedly visibly cringe when Taylor's name came up in conversation. To her, his music was the sound of compromise. Competent, well-produced, but soulless. She reportedly told confidants that Taylor had neutered folk music, transforming it from a medium of protest and personal revelation into something cozy and toothless, meant for mass consumption rather than deep connection. Her most cutting criticism may have been that Taylor's success represented not just a personal disappointment, but a betrayal of folk's larger mission. Folk had once been a genre that stood up against injustice, that carried voices from the margins into the mainstream. In Mitchell's view, Taylor took all that power and watered it down until it was palatable for suburban living rooms. It was, in her words, like turning a fire into candlelight, pleasant, but ultimately powerless. And yet, perhaps what hurt most was that Mitchell saw the talent in him. She reportedly acknowledged, at least privately, that Taylor had begun as a gifted songwriter. But in her mind, he wasted that gift, choosing security over artistry. That decision, more than his actual music, was what she could never forgive. Fleetwood Mac. Next is Fleetwood Mac, a feud that perfectly captured the clash between artistic integrity and commercial success. To Joni Mitchell, Fleetwood Mac wasn't just another successful rock band. They were the embodiment of everything she feared about the music industry. Spectacle replacing substance, gossip masquerading as art. Mitchell had known Fleetwood Mac back in their early days, when they were a gritty blues outfit with Peter Green at the helm. By the mid-1970s, however, the band had reinvented itself, pivoting into a polished pop-rock juggernaut. Their 1977 album Rumors became one of the best-selling records of all time, fueled not just by catchy melodies but by the band's notorious personal drama. Affairs, breakups, betrayals, all of which were baked into the songs themselves. For millions of fans, this mixture of music and soap opera was irresistible. For Mitchell, it was artistic betrayal. She allegedly described their transformation as relationship drama set to stadium rock, dismissing Rumors as little more than a cleverly packaged diary of dysfunction. Where audiences heard catharsis, Mitchell saw exploitation, band members turning their pain into marketing copy. The spectacle infuriated her. As she once remarked of her own work, both sides now worked as a pretty good synopsis. Philosophically, it kind of rounded everything up. For her, songwriting was about distilling universal truths from personal experience. Fleetwood Mac, in her mind, had reduced songwriting to tabloid journalism. The musical critique was just as cutting. Mitchell reportedly said that Fleetwood Mac's later work was formulaic pop disguised as emotional depth. The soaring harmonies and shimmering production, she felt, were window dressing for songs that followed the same structural blueprint again and again. To her, they were selling comfort food to an audience that preferred familiarity over the challenge of innovation. This rankled Mitchell deeply, because she had built her career on doing the opposite, reinventing herself album after album, refusing to settle into a predictable groove. What annoyed her most, however, wasn't simply the music. It was the way Fleetwood Mac's personal drama became part of their brand. While Mitchell's own life had certainly inspired her music, she drew a clear line between the art and the gossip. She revealed emotion through metaphor, poetic abstraction, and layered storytelling. Fleetwood Mac, by contrast, gave interviews openly dissecting who slept with whom and which breakup inspired which song. Mitchell allegedly found this approach degrading, arguing that it reduced the art form to nothing more than a sideshow for voyeuristic fans. Industry sources claimed that Mitchell would become visibly angry when critics compared her relationship songs to Fleetwood Mac's. To her, there was no comparison. Her songs were complex emotional explorations, existential reflections dressed in melody, while Fleetwood Mac's were, in her eyes, simplistic dramatizations of romantic squabbles. She allegedly bristled at the idea that her deeply personal philosophical work could be lumped in with what she saw as gossip-driven pop. At the core of Mitchell's disdain was a sense that Fleetwood Mac's overwhelming success proved an ugly truth about audiences and the industry itself. Subtlety and sophistication no longer mattered. The millions who bought Rumors weren't celebrating musical complexity or lyrical innovation. They were buying into the band's soap opera. For Mitchell, who had always believed that music should elevate rather than pander, this was devastating. It confirmed her fear that the industry no longer rewarded artistry, but drama. Neil Young. Out of all the musical rivalries attached to Joni Mitchell, this is the one that shocks people the most. On the surface, it seems almost unthinkable. Both were Canadian folk legends. Both emerged from the same fertile musical era of the late 1960s, and both became icons of a generation searching for meaning in music. By all accounts, Mitchell and Young should have been natural allies. Instead, what unfolded was one of the most bitter and personal artistic rifts in modern rock history. Mitchell reportedly saw Young as a pretentious fake, someone who built his career not on genuine artistry, but on manufactured authenticity. To her, Young wasn't so much a visionary as he was a carefully curated image. His so-called tortured artist persona, Mitchell believed, was less a reflection of real turmoil and more a calculated pose designed to make him seem profound, brooding, and serious. In her view, it was a mask, and one that the music press eagerly bought into. While Young's fans and critics praised his raw, emotional performances, Mitchell allegedly dismissed them as amateur dramatics. She supposedly felt his voice, thin, nasally, and often straining, was not a badge of authenticity, but a liability that audiences romanticized far too much. To her ear, it wasn't soulful grit, it was simply bad singing. The same went for his guitar playing, which she called sloppy and unrefined. For Mitchell, real musicianship meant precision, depth, and mastery. Young, in her view, had none of that, just the ability to create the illusion of sincerity. Her musical criticism was brutal. Mitchell allegedly said that Young's experimental phases were nothing more than random noise dressed up as innovation. Where critics saw daring exploration, she saw chaos with no guiding artistic principle. His reputation as an innovator infuriated her because, from her perspective, it was undeserved. Mitchell worked tirelessly at refining her compositions, complex tunings, unusual chord progressions, lyrics with layers of meaning, yet it was Young who seemed to garner more critical respect. What truly enraged Mitchell was not only the imbalance in recognition, but also the way Young's shortcomings were reinterpreted as strengths. His moodiness was called intensity. His inconsistency was reframed as creative bravery. His difficulty with collaborators was mythologized as the burden of genius. Meanwhile, female artists who behaved similarly, including Mitchell herself, were often labeled temperamental, unstable, or unprofessional. This double standard cut to the core of the feud. Young became, in Mitchell's eyes, the embodiment of everything wrong with how the music industry lionized male artists while minimizing or dismissing women. The resentment took on an almost philosophical dimension. Mitchell allegedly argued that Young had fooled an entire generation into confusing difficulty with importance. In her most devastating critique, she said his influence poisoned the well for younger musicians, encouraging them to lean on attitude, image, and posturing rather than on true craftsmanship. In her eyes, the cult of Neil Young didn't just celebrate mediocrity. It rewarded it, paving the way for waves of derivative artists who mistook being abrasive or mysterious for being meaningful. What do you think about the bands that Joni Mitchell hates the most? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.